marking 30 years since the National Peace Accord was signed by political leaders, labor, religious leaders, civil society and businesses, paving the way for what would become a relatively peaceful transition to democracy. It helped create a National Peace Secretariat and committees to help stem violence in the country. This after the then National Party, the ANC and IFP had been at loggerheads over a newly redesigned South Africa. Well, let's talk about the significance of the National Peace Accord. We're joined by Transformation Initiative Director Roelf Meyer. Mr. Meyer, good evening to you and thank you so much for your time. Of course, oftentimes when we look at the transition to democracy in this country and we talk about the violence that threatened that moment of reaching where we are today, it's often glossed over. So, there was a bit of violence, but then a miracle happened, and now we have democracy. And yet, 30 years of the signing of the National Peace Accord reminds us that the situation was very, very different to that.
Absolutely, Kathy. It was actually very, very tense. The period that followed the release of President Mandela from prison, as well as the unbanning of the ANC and other liberation struggle movements. And the period that followed and the intensity of the contestation that followed from that created an atmosphere of violence in the country. Actually, violence erupted in many parts of the country, one can say in almost all around the country. And when we saw some of the same happening 2 months ago in South Africa, particularly in KZN and Gauteng, it reminded us of what we went through more than 30 years ago on an ongoing basis for months, until that moment that the Peace Accord was signed on the 14th of September 1991 by the leaders, as you referred to. And that helped us to, I won't say put it all in place at once, but it helped us to address the fundamentals of the political violence. And the local peace committees that were formed all around the country, through which people representing the liberation movements, activists, as well as people representing the establishment as it was at that stage, the apartheid government, could start talking to each other, and space was created for that, and that helped us to calm the situation, to stabilize it to the extent that eventually the constitutional negotiations could get underway.
Of course, 30 years on, there's great opportunity to sit and reflect on the strengths of the time, which I think have been emphasized, but also on the weaknesses of the Peace Accord and what it sought to achieve. So the peace that was managed for that period was dealing with symptoms of what was inherently a very broken society, not just from colonialism, but also from apartheid. And we have carried many of those threads into democracy.
Yeah, unfortunately so. There were two elements to what we had to deal with. The one was to find a constitutional framework that could bring about democracy in South Africa. And I think we can say we succeeded in doing that. The Constitution eventually, the final Constitution of 1996, I think gave birth to the democratic aspirations of the nation. But there was the other side as well, and that is what one can call these socioeconomic aspirations, also being referred to in the Constitution by means of Chapter 2, the fundamental rights that every citizen is entitled to. But the actual implementation of those rights and the way in which it didn't give actually or didn't fulfill the expectations of the people is something that we still are suffering today in South Africa. And I think there is reason to believe that we have to put more attention to this, more energy to this, and also see how we can deal with the subject of inequality that's still prevalent in our society.
It's a challenge of inequality. There's the issue of, ethnicity, of identity, of racism. Many of those issues still continue to plague our society, and and deepen the divides that exist in South Africa. How do you think we can be responding to those problems? Because ultimately, you referenced, the violence that we saw in July. And when we look at some of the causal factors of what leads to the kind of violence we saw, it's the environment of the country we are in.
What we've seen recently is not totally unrelated to what we have experienced 30 years ago. And like we have at that stage succeeded in overcoming the problems by means of sitting down, having dialogue, talking to each other as communities and as people with different persuasions, helped us to overcome the problem. And I think maybe we should go back to that same experience and say to each other, what we are experiencing today have to be addressed, and we can best do that by looking each other in the eye and create an atmosphere of resolving our problems instead of the kind of unrest that we have seen in July.
One of the things that, you've been mentioning similarities between what we saw in July versus the period of the time that the peace accord was signed in. We also know that we still have a high proliferation of weapons in this country, and that in itself is also historic. And yet more and more, we are continuing to live with the dangers of unaccounted for weapons.
Yeah, some of the bad experiences of the past, even pre-30 years ago, are still around in our society, and that makes the task of law enforcement very, very difficult. But at the same time, I think what we've also indicated more recently is the fact that, we need proper capacity to deal with the kind of violence that erupted, and also have to rely on reliable intelligence as far as that is. That's the best way to put a stop to this kind of violence and to like I say, create a space where we can sit down in a peaceful way and addressing the fundamentals that need to be addressed. So on the one side, there's legitimacy for unhappiness based on the inequality that prevail. But on the other side, there's also those that use the moment for their own benefits, and whether those aspirations are legitimate, I doubt. So, there are two elements to this that we have to address. And going back to the experience of 30 years ago, I think we can benefit from enriching our insights from that experience.
Director of the In Transformation Initiative, Roelf Meyer, let me thank you for your time tonight.